and welcome to Defeating the Feminist Frame, presented by myself, Professor Hamster, and my colleague, Mia. Today, Defeating the Feminist Frame presents Suffrage, Feminism's First Act of Female Supremacy. Feminists will often bring up the vote as evidence that men refused to give women the rights they deserved historically, thus women were oppressed. The vote is the primary weapon feminists use to frame the debate regarding equality. As such, it should be removed from their arsenal as early as possible. Before I address how to disarm this feminist attack, I'll first address the false parallel drawn between the history of women's suffrage and the history of suffrage for poor and minority groups. The first thing you'll note is that when poor and minority groups started their journey towards full suffrage, they often began by assuming or agitating to assume the responsibilities of citizenship, such as conscription and wartime service. Often their efforts to assume these citizenship duties met resistance. This resistance was not due to the desire to prevent minorities from experiencing the depredations of war service, but due to the possibility that assuming said responsibilities would lead to their full enfranchisement as citizens. I'd like to pause here and note that minorities and women used two very different tactics when approaching suffrage. Minorities often agitated for citizenship duties prior to, or in conjunction with, agitating for the vote. It's entirely possible that minority groups might never have been considered for the vote had they had not first sacrificed considerably in service to the state. During the civil rights movement, for example, black moderates believed that black people needed to earn their civil rights. Extremists at the time believed black people should receive their civil rights by virtue of being human beings. Women, by way of contrast, did not agitate for citizenship responsibilities, nor apparently was assuming them a requirement of being considered for franchise, as is the case with many minority groups. Now let's look for a moment at the different mentalities women versus minorities brought to the issue of suffrage. Minorities felt they had to earn their rights, and often had to make enormous sacrifices in wartime prior to even having their request for rights considered reasonable. Women felt they were simply owed, and the government agreed. These two mentalities reflect very different social standings. Minorities approach suffrage from the usual mentality of people who are actually oppressed. We have to earn everything, including citizenship rights, whereas women approached the issue of suffrage from a mentality of privilege and entitlement. We are owed our rights. With this attitude of entitlement, is it any wonder that when women requested their citizenship rights, they weren't actually requesting equality, but requesting the government create two classes of citizen? One with obligations, men, one without, women. By any reasonable measure, this is not equality but supremacy. Why let feminists draw the line between inequality and equality as the right to vote, when the most recent example of inequality is the state deciding one group of citizens must abdicate their bodily autonomy to the state, become the property of the state, while another does not? In that sense, men in the UK achieved citizenship equality with women in 1960. That is, they received the right not to be seen as state property to be disposed of as the state wishes 54 years ago. Men in Canada achieved citizenship equality with the passing of the Emergencies Act in 1988, 26 years ago. And men in the US still haven't achieved citizenship equality to this date. When a feminist says women didn't get the right to vote till insert date, mention that female suffrage enabled women to vote for wars only men had to fight in. If necessary, use the following analogy. What if white people could vote for wars only black people had to fight in? What would that be called? And finish off with, suffrage was feminism's first act of female supremacy. You have now successfully challenged the feminist frame.